So this talk is about the normativity of logic. I've been working on this for quite a bit now, and I'm still struggling in sort of finalizing it to a paper. So it's a great occasion for me actually to present this work with you, with this audience, and especially because you are both logicians, philosophers of logic, and philosophers of truth, and among other things, of course, epistemologists and so on. But this talk is yeah, it brings together some stuff on the philosophy of logic and truth and normativity. So I think it's one of the best possible audience I may have. So the plan is to introduce some taxonomical remarks and distinction, which might be relevant to assess whether logic is normative. So I will do some taxonomy. And then I'll discuss at least one prominent extrinsicist strategy to explain the normativity of logic, which takes truth to be the source of logical normativity. And my aim in that part of the talk is just to raise some objections. And then in the last part, I sketch an intrinsicist alternative. So I will argue that there is a sense in which logic is intrinsically normative, and I explain in what sense I think logic is intrinsically normative. Okay, if you have any clarificatory question during the talk, I'm happy to take them. So in case you like. Okay, so when we think about the question whether logic is normative, there is an intuitive sense in which it seems pretty obvious that that it is normative, because we would like to say things like some patterns of reasoning are good, for example, those based on modus ponens or disjunctive syllogism. So we use this kind of form of inference very often, even if we don't maybe realize that. And other kind of patterns of reasoning might be bad. So for example, those based on denying the antecedent, affirming the consequence, or other sort of principles or putative rules. And I think that a natural explanation of this intuition is that correct patterns of reasoning exemplify logically valid rules of inference, while patterns of reasoning that exemplify invalid rules are incorrect. So I think this kind of very sort of superficial and intuitive sense in which logic is normative, it's actually correct. And I try to sort of indicate this intuition, or at least this kind of pre-theoretical judgment that we have about that, and try to say that it's actually a characteristic of logic, and in particular of the notion of logical consequence, to be the source of this normative constraint. Okay. And so when we're talking about the normativity of logic, of course, we need to ask what is logic, which is a very difficult question. So I'm not going to try to be exhaustive about that. I hope just to be at least partly correct. So I know that there are various views about the nature of logic. Probably the mainstream view is that logic is about validity, or about logical consequence. I mean, one of the sort of the primary subject matter of logic is to study what follows from what and why. That's sometimes it's called the metalinguistic view of logic and sort of logic subject matter. There are people who disagree about that, in particular Williamson, but for the sake of this talk, I take logic to be primarily concerned with validity. So what follows from what, and in this sense, I mean, taking logic to be the study of validity, and it seems kind of quite straightforward to understand it as, in partly at least, as a normative disciplines. At least some people have sort of make this connection quite straightforward, and one of these philosophers is Graham Priest, who says that logic is supposed to provide an account of correct reasoning, and where correct is, of course, a normative notion here. So Graham I don't think that it would agree on seeing the normativity of logic as an intrinsic feature of logic, but nevertheless, he thinks that logic plays a normative role with respect to reasoning. My sort of contribution is to try to argue that logic is intrinsically normative for reasoning, but in a minimal sense, and I will clarify what that means. So for me, logic is the study of validity as sort of used in reasoning context. What follows from what's in the vernacular, as Priest says. Okay. Of course, you can contest already this starting point. There are, as I said, other views on the nature of logic, and it might be harder to sort of argue for the intrinsicist, for an intrinsicist strategy in the case of more objectual understanding of the subject matter of logic. But I'm sort of here relying on what probably is the mainstream view, at least what I think is the mainstream view. Okay. With that in hand, we can clarify different questions when we are interested in understanding whether logic is normative. So one question that has been very much discussed in the debate is how we should conceive of the normative function that logic exerts on reasoning. And that is a function question in the sense that is there a role that logic plays with respect to reasoning, a normative role? And all the debate that has been going on for quite a few years now has been concerned with that question. So starting from McFarland's 2004 paper, is logic in what sense, if any, is logic normative? And he introduces that this tool, very useful tool of bridge principles, as we will see later. And that is exactly to try to provide a sort of clarify the role that the normative role that logic could play with respect to reasoning, understood as belief management, basically. Another question, which is sometimes neglected. I mean, nowadays in the more recent debate, more people are sort of also trying to address the other question, but at least in the original McFarland debates and also the contribution of Steinberger and others, we're slightly neglecting the other question, which is what I call the source question. So where does the normative characters of logic come from? So what's the source of normativity? So we have a role question, and then we have a source question. So we might think that logic plays a normative role, but then there is a residual question of, okay, how do we explain that? So what is the source? And then there is another question concerning the consequences of what we think is the correct view on logical normativity, in particular with respect to logical anti-exceptionism. So one of the interesting questions is, if we think that logic is intrinsically normative, what would that mean for the sort of debate on exceptionism and anti-exceptionism? To what extent would that make logic exceptional, so to speak, or not? I will be concerned primarily with the first and the second question, and my contribution would like to be on the second question. I briefly say something at the end about the third if I like. Okay, so when we focus on the more general question about logical normativity, I think it would be useful to distinguish two broad views. So the anti-normativist and the normativist. So the anti-normativist is adopt the thesis that logic has no normative bearing on reasoning. There is a sort of a radical reading of some of Arman work, which might suggest that. I mean, I don't want to make any sort of exegetical point here, because I think Arman is more nuanced than this kind of bare anti-normativist stance. But at least there is this idea that Arman has expressed in various work, that while the theory of reasoning is about belief maintenance and revision, logic is a theory that deals only with deductive relation between propositions, and so it claims that whereas logical principles are not directly rules of belief revisions, and they are not particularly about belief or the other mental states and acts that constitute reasoning at all. So there are passages where he claimed that there are no interesting normative bridges between logic and reasoning. So I would like to point to one particular understanding that Arman has of reasoning as sort of reason changing view. So it's about belief revision and maintenance. So this is important because later I will challenge this understanding of reasoning, which I think is very limited, at least for the purposes of understanding the normativity of logic. So I think there has been a lot of debate about Arman's position on the normativity of logic and all these sort of McFarland's inspired sort of discussion about logical normativity has been focusing on replying to some of the main challenges that Arman has put forward in some of his work. But I think Arman was sort of so was restricting his criticism to one particular kind of bridge principle, as McFarland has pointed out, which might be the most implausible one among the various ones that you may have. And also he had a peculiar understanding of what reasoning is as just limited to belief revision and maintenance. So if you sort of relax these two kind of assumption, there is a lot of space for a sensible discussion, reasonable discussion about the normativity of logic. If you stick with Arman's assumption, then the space is very limited to sort of make the case that logic is normative in any interesting sense. Okay, and so if you want to drop or at least relax some of the assumption, then you might want to sort of explore another broad view, which is normativism, which is the broad thesis that logic is somewhat normative for reasoning. And I think we can have a different sort of understanding of this view. So there is what I take is the entry point of normativism, which I call here the normative role thesis, which is the thesis that logical principles have normative consequences in that they play a role in constraining reasoning. So again, this is the role thesis. So the claims is that logic has a role to play in normatively constraining reason. And then there are two more substantive theses. One is the normative constitution thesis, which says that basic logical laws are constitutive laws of reasoning. This kind of constitution thesis has been advocated recently by Jessica Leach and Manish Oza. They defend different views of constitutivism. And the last thesis is the normative source thesis, which says that logic is intrinsically normative in the sense that logical principle provide the source of the constraints operating on reasoning. Now, a brief comment on these three theses. So I think that normative constitution thesis and normative source thesis, they both imply normative role thesis. So they presupposes that logic plays a normative role in reasoning. The constitution thesis and the source thesis are independent. At least there is space for arguing that you might have a constitution thesis, but still being an extrinsicist. And this is the position that Manish Oza actually defends. I don't know whether at the end of the day is a coherent position. I mean, whether it can really be defended, but yeah, he has this kind of fill-in print paper on that, and at least is a position that has been discussed. So I will be interested in particularly in the source thesis. Because I want to defend that. Okay, so let me briefly say something about then the role thesis and the source thesis, just to make the sort of clearer what are the sort of the steps there. So the normative role thesis amounts to the view that there are interesting normative bridges between logic and reasoning. And here we have, as I already mentioned, a lot of work that has been done by McFarland and by Steinberger, by other people. in terms of trying to sort of identify or find the best sort of bridge principle, which explain the connection, the normative connection between logic and reasoning, and is able to also reply to Armand's objection. So bridge principle, I'm sure you already know this notion, but in a general, the structure of a bridge principle is the one that you see on the handout. So on the left hand is a material conditional, so it's expressed as a conditional, and on the left hand side of the conditional there is a logical fact, a fact about validity, so that a certain proposition follows from other propositions. And then on the right-hand side of the conditional, you have some sort of normative claim about which combination of the exhausted attitudes to have in relation to the propositions on the left-hand side involved in the consequence relation. And so, for example, one of the bridge principle that McFarland likes is something like, so if C is a logical consequence of A and B, then it ought not to be the case that a subject disbelieves C if she believes A and B, something like that. So it's a negative polarity sort of wide scope ought principle. It doesn't matter which one we prefer. There is a discussion about whether this wide scope negative ought is the best one or not. Because my claim is I accept the normative role thesis. I'm happy to sort of have one or more bridge principle operating as expressing the normative role that logic plays with respect to reasoning, because what I'm interested in is to understand what is the underlying source. Because if you just look at the bridge principle as just as a conditional, they do not say much about the source. So they just say that there is this normative, this link, this kind of link, interesting sort of link between logical facts and reasoning and norms of reasoning, but it doesn't say much about where does this kind of normativity come from. So one way in which you can actually understand an intrinsicist view about logical normativity is to read the conditional there as a sort of explanatory conditional or as a sort of grounding conditional, in the sense that you might want to say that the sort of correctness condition or the ought on the right-hand side of this conditional is grounded in a logical fact. I mean, I'm using fact in a very sort of minimal sense. I don't want to sort of put too much weight on that, but on a validity, so you might want to say that the ought on the right-hand side is grounded in there being a relation of logical consequence between certain proposition and other proposition. So that's one way you could sort of make explicit the attempt to be an intrinsicist about logical consequence. But the more general claim, regardless of whether you endorse a bridge principle and you want to read the conditional there as an explanatory conditional or as a grounding conditional, the main claim of the intrinsicist is that there is something intrinsic to the very nature of the relation of logical consequence between A and B and C that grounds the constraints that an agent has with respect to the combination of cognitive attitudes or exhaustive attitudes to have with respect to the proposition involved. In particular, when this means that you are going to read the normative operator that is on the right-hand side of the bridge principle as a distinctively normative, distinctively logical normative operator, like the ought is a logical ought, or the correctness is a logical correctness, and so on and so forth. So my own view at the end of the day will be more or less than that. So I'm not gonna claim that there is any distinctively logical ought, but the idea will be that there is a distinctively sort of sense of correctness that comes from logic. So this is just to illustrate one way in which you could be an intrinsicist, and one strategy you could have. Okay. So I think that in the current stage of the debate, the most sort of popular view is an extrinsicist view. So many people are like extrinsicists in the sense that they might want to allow that contra Arman perhaps that logic plays a normative role with respect to reasoning. But they don't want to claim that there is something special about normatively special about logic, so to speak. So that the kind of normative constraint that logic exerts on reasoning, exemplified by the bridge principle, is something that has to do with the nature of logic or of validity or any other sort of logical notion. And so the idea is to try to outsource, so to speak, the normativity there. And some of the theses that have been defended, some in print, some in talks that I've attended or in conversation, are the following. So the external source have been identified with truth. That's something that has been defended actually in print by a few people, with rationality and with intuition or considered judgment about validity in the vernacular, in sort of judgment we have with respect to what follows from what. Okay, I will focus on truth because I think it's the most interesting one. I also have some sort of views on the other two possible sources, and of course, if there are other sources, I mean, I'm happy to discuss them with you. I mean, one might think that knowledge is a source of normativity, but so far in the debate, as I said, truth has been the one that has been defended the most. So I'll focus on that. And also because I've worked a little bit on truth, so I'm more familiar with that. I have more interesting thing to say, perhaps. Okay. So what is this kind of extrinsicist strategy that takes truth to be the source? So the basic idea, I mean, the basic reasoning is that like logic is some normative constraint on reasoning via the notion of logical consequence or notion of validity as it is sort of represented in bridge principle. So we see a bridge principle, there is a consequence relation on the left, and then there is some sort of normative vocabulary or normative constraint expressed on the right. And so that's this sort of entry point for like understanding the role and the normative role of logic. And then, of course, most people in the debate take logical consequence to be standardly defined in terms of necessary truth preservation. And so because truth is part of the characterization of logical consequence, they take logical normativity to be source in analytic normativity, in truth normativity. And then you can sort of rely on some other work that has been done in an independent sort of debate on analytic normativity. You might think that there are so that truth is a norm, truth is a norm of belief, or truth is a norm of assertion, depending on whether you are focusing on mental states or mental or speech acts. And you might endorse something like we ought to believe only what is true. I mean, it is a very unrefined norm. Doesn't matter for our purposes, but just to sort of have something in hand. I've discussed the issue of the normativity of truth in one book that I published a few years ago, and so there are of course a lot of way of refining analytic norms and trying to understand their role in the complex environment of doxastic normativity in general. But for the purposes of this talk, I think so we might just endorse something like that. And then the reasoning goes on and says, so what's good about logical consequences that in reasoning in accordance with it, we never worsen our analytic situation. So we never, so if we start with truths, we are guaranteed to end up with truths. And so it's a safe way. So following logical consequence, so to speak, is a safe way of complying with analytic norms. And a few people in the debate has defended that view, in particular Jill Russell and Chris Blake Turner have papers in which they claim that logic is a descriptive discipline, on very much like physics and chemistry and mathematics. And they also claim that, yes, sure, logic has some normative consequences, but only alongside other normative assumptions. And so, for example, G. Russell says, in conjunction with common normative commitments concerning truth and falsity, for example, only believe what is true, don't reason to false conclusion, logics have normative consequences. If this is how logic is entangled with the normative, then it shares this status with paradigmatically descriptive scientific theories, including those of physics and mathematics. So the idea is that logic is very much physics, and so it has normative consequences as all the other disciplines, but just in conjunction with sort of the sort of commitments, normative commitment concerning truth and falsity. Okay, so that's the view, more or less. So I have a few worries about the view. So the first one is actually more of a curiosity, or a sort of a question to sort of dig deeper on an invitation to dig deeper on the issue, because one might ask, is truth actually the source of normativity? Where the source here, I mean the intrinsic, so the ultimate source, right? So we are interested in understanding the source, and at some point we need to sort of fix on some ultimate source of normativity. And as we all know here, whether truth itself is normative is a rather debated issue. And in a footnote of the 2020 paper that I've quoted there, Jill Russell seems to deny actually that truth is an intrinsic norm, or that truth is the ultimate source of normativity, as I would put it. But then there is a question for Jill or anybody who has a similar view, namely, okay, so if the project is to source logical normativity and truth normativity, what should we say then if truth is not intrinsically normative? Truth is not the ultimate source of normativity. What is the ultimate source of normativity? And here is a request of filling some details, because I think it's important to understand exactly how the story goes on, and to tell a story about the source of logical normativity that is plausible. I mean, that might be reasonable with respect to our aim of understanding logic's role in reasoning, normative roles in reasoning. So here I'm not filling the story for them. I'm just asking, okay, so what should we say more, right? As some of you know very well, so some people have claimed, like for example, Paul Orridge has this view that logic has a normative function, except a normative function. Sorry, not logic, truth except a normative function. But the source of the normativity of truth is not truth itself. So truth is not an intrinsically normative concept, but is rather a sort of moral commitment, or a moral norm, that we ought to desire what is truth and not and only what is true, something like that. So so Orridge take, of course, seriously the quest for grounding the normativity of truth, and he thinks that, for example, morality is the ultimate source of the normativity of truth. So that could work also for logic, but probably we need some detail there. And even if we establish that truth is, at the end of the day, the ultimate source of normativity, the issue of how to systematically derive logical normativity from analytic normativity is not at all straightforward. And there is a very interesting paper by Diego Tajer on this issue. So this is more kind of a not really an objection, but more kind of, okay, so we should provide more detail. The other two issues are more of an objection. So the first one is actually a collapse problem. So, and the question is this really an extrinsicist strategy or an intrinsicist one in disguise? So let's assume that truth is intrinsically normative and provides the ultimate source of logical normativity. And as I said, many people agree with the standard understanding of logical consequence as necessary truth preservation. So truth is defined in terms, logical consequence is defined in terms of truth and necessary truth preservation. And so truth is part of the very notion of logical consequence. And then one might think, okay, so but if truth is an intrinsic, so is an essential part of is a part of the definition of logical consequence, then shouldn't we conclude that logical consequence is an essentially and thus intrinsically normative relation? So I'm here relying on a sort of metaphysical principle. I don't know whether it's sort of completely sound. I mean, so far I haven't sort of encountered objection to it, but I mean. So the principle is that if f is an intrinsic feature of P1, which is in turn an essential component of P2, then f is an intrinsic feature of P2. So if normativity is an intrinsic feature of truth, which is an essential component of logical consequence, then normativity is an intrinsic feature of logical consequence. So that's the kind of collapse issue that I see. And the third point is actually something that I'm still sort of trying to make it work, in the sense that I find it plausible. Is kind of an intuition that I have, and I think I will say something later that seems to sort of go in that direction. But yeah, probably is the main resistance is with this. So my sense is that there is a distinctive shortcoming associated with failing to reason in accordance with logical rules, which is not explained in terms of truth or falsity. And here you can just imagine a subject who happens to believe only true proposition, but commits a lot of logical fallacies. For example, affirming the consequence in his reasoning with truth proposition. But because he's very lucky and he's in this kind of scenario where he's only sort of dealing with true proposition, he never end up with any false belief. And you can make the scenario as moderately robust as you want. I mean, all counterparts of this person are just as lucky as this person. So just to avoid immediate safety sort of worries. But the idea is just you can make a very strong scenario there, as strong as you want, because the sort of the point of the intuition is exactly that. There might be a situation where truth might not be relevant with respect to the assessment of the correctness or incorrectness of the reasoning activity of the subject. So, and in this kind of scenario, the subject is irreproachable from the point of view of dialectic norm, but we think that there is something wrong with what she's doing. So she's just sort of reasoning with bad rules. And we may have a sort of case, opposite case, where you have a subject who is always reason with good rules, with logically valid rules, but it's very unlucky and only sort of deal with falsehoods. Perhaps you are in a radical skeptical scenario where everything is deceptive. So the environment is non-collaborative, and you you have a lot of false belief, but then you might be able to reason correctly with respect to those beliefs. So the sense, the slogan, let's say, of the intuition is that one might reason poorly with truths and be lucky enough to never end up with falsities, or reason very well with untruths and be very unlucky with that. So that is the sort of worry that I have with respect to the truth strategy, and is more so whereas the second issue I think might be a real issue with respect to a collapse or real collapse, and then that would be a straightforward route, even if you are sort of insisting that truth is the source of normativity, to be an intrinsicist. This one is more of intuition that I would like to substantiate. And I will say something about one way in which you could make this more plausible, or at least more sort of substantive. And I do that in the last part of the talk. This is the last part of the talk where I am sort of say something about so defending and developing the intrinsic strategy. Okay. So my aim is to locate the ultimate source of normativity of logic into the notion of logical consequence, and I will not say much about what notion of intrinsicality is sort of I'm using here. I'm still unsure about what's the best option, but there are many notions of intrinsicality, and there is this nice Stanford Encyclopedia entry by Marshall and Wederson, where they explore different views of intrinsicality. So I haven't sort of settled on one with respect to the notion of logical consequence, but I think there might be one that fits the purpose. Okay, and the first point that I want to make is to return to reasoning. So we started with this idea that logic is normative for reasoning, and I already criticize. I mean, at least so I'm not the only one, but some people have criticized Arman for having sort of a narrow understanding of reasoning as just reason changed in view, which is sort of belief management and revision. I want to sort of be more ecumenical with the notion of reasoning. Of course, also reason and change in view is a part of our overall theory of reasoning. But I think also that there is an important aspect of reasoning that might be called deducing, which is a doxastic activity that consists in drawing a certain conclusion for certain propositions which are held as premises. So there are some interesting work on this kind of inferring or deducing. So Macfarlane is very skeptical about actually this move. So there are a couple of passages in I don't remember whether it's in the 2004 paper or the 2017 paper, but where he's sort of discarding this view as not very interesting, because it thinks like, okay, so this just the kind of activity that only logicians do, so it's not very interesting in understanding the normativity of logic. But I think it's actually very interesting in understanding the normativity of logic. I mean, Macfarlane has the tendency also, with respect to his view on truth and relative truth, to sort of dismiss certain kind of philosophy of mind inquiries, and just doesn't like to sort of investigate much whether there are sort of interesting cognitive or mental activities that might sort of be interesting to explore, especially with respect to retraction. In assessment sensitivity has a very, very radical view against the possibility of having anything like mental retraction. But beside that, so I think that there is some interesting work by Ramfit, Ulf Lobil, and Shaw on this issue on inferring or deducing. And here is a passage from Ian Ramfit. So there is a species of intellectual activity that logicians' rules can be thought of as regulating. Sometimes a thinker engages in the task of tracing out the implication of some premises. Sometimes, indeed, he does this step by step, taking special care to move only to conclusions that the premises really imply. Let us call this activity deduction. Unlike inferences, deduction do take time, and they are subject to intentional control. They can also be achievements. To infer B from A, we said, is to take up to accept B as a result of reflecting on A. But in drawing out the implication of A, one might reach B without accepting it, and a fortiori without accepting it as a result of reflecting on A. So if B is known to be false, it might instead issue in the thinkers accepting the negation of A on the basis of negation of B, equally, though it might not issue in any inference at all. So this is one model that Ian Ramfit has developed of this kind of activity of deducing. So the passage is actually much longer. So his discussion is in his 2011 work is an interesting discussion about that kind of activity. I'm here sort of happy to be quite ecumenical with how to understand deducing. But I think there is something interesting to be said about that kind of mental activity. And reasoning as deducing, of course, has to be contrasted with reasoning as deliberate change in view, understood as Arman did in terms of belief management and revision. And the latter is more general and normatively much more structured than the former. Because when we are thinking about management of belief, there are many things that come into the picture. And there are sort of evidential norms, there are truth norms, there are prudential norms sometimes, or immoral norms at least. And so the sort of normative structure of this kind of deliberate change in view is, or doxastic deliberation, as Schein-Velleman call it, is much more structured than the one of deducing. But I think that they are both legitimate activity, or at least a sense of reasoning, and they have important differences. So, for example, deducing need not end in changing view, especially, for example, when it's done suppositionally. And an inference or a deduction can be good even if one ends up with a belief in a conclusion that one ought not to believe because it's false or unjustified. And this is not something that is true for belief management or belief revision. Okay, but if we fix only on the notion of reasoning as a deliberate change in view, of course, I think is as I already said at the beginning, is quite easy to make a case against logic having an important or interesting distinctive sense of normativity with respect to reasoning. Because there are a lot of deliberate change in view for which logic plays no special role. So if I sort of come to believe that it's raining by a testimony, and then I sort of look out the window, so I come to believe that it's raining because of your testimony, then I look out the window and I see that it's sunny, the weather is actually it's not raining. I just revise my belief in accordance with the evidence, and this here kind of an immediate sort of evidence that strikes me as very strong, and and so I abandon my belief that it's raining, and there is no reasoning sort of, and so logic of course plays no role in this kind of situation, at least not in the sense of being part of a reasoning pattern. So there is one residual sort of worry that one might have with respect even with Arman when he was challenging the normative role of logic by sort of this kind of problem of so the example that you end up with a very weird conclusion, and so you always have the option of sort of get rid of one of the premises. And in this case, I mean, also in the case that this kind of little example, the reason why we change our view rather than just simply adding another belief to our belief box is exactly because we want to preserve consistency, right? So it's not that, I form the belief that it's raining, and then I look outside and I see sunny, and I form the belief it's sunny. And of course, it would be contradictory beliefs. And that is something that I don't want. So that's why I drop one and I keep the other. So there is a consistency norm underlying this kind of operation, even in basic cases, which one might think is a logical constraint. But so I'm open to other interpretations there. So my concern with the way Harman has set up the debate is that investigating normative logic in relation to reasoning by focusing on belief revision and management is very restrictive, because there is a lot of background noise. There are a lot of other norms that are sort of operating in this kind of activity of deliberate change in view. And I'm totally with Arman here and with the anti-normativist in this that we are not going to be able to find an all thing considered ought that is sort of driven by logic here, right? So I think that is something that is out of the picture. So at least when it comes to belief revision. But if we are focusing on reasoning as deducing, we don't have to worry about the complex set of norms that are relevant for belief management and belief revision. Okay, so for example, if you're interested in whether an agent has reasoned correctly from a set of premises to a certain conclusion, then logic, I think, has something interesting to say, of course. So we should ask in relation to those cases whether logic plays a distinctive normative role. And if we consider suppositional reasoning, I think is an interesting case there because we take no epistemic or analytic commitment whatsoever towards the proposition involved in it, right? In fact, a key feature of suppositional reasoning is that while a supposition is in place, there is no normative pressure to reject the conclusion. Even if it is known to be false or evidentially unsupported or even absurd. In fact, sometimes we even assume certain proposition for reductive purposes, for example. Okay, so the kind of normative assessment we're concerned with reasoning as deducing is not about whether we should believe the conclusion, but rather about whether the transition from the premises to the conclusion is a correct one to make. And here correctness for me is conformity with logical rules. So the notion that so the normative notion that I want to push here is a notion of correctness as not necessarily understood in a sort of directive sense with this strong form of normativity that is generally expressed by an ought. Is a standard of correctness which is much weaker. So of course one of the questions here is whether it's strong enough to be considered normativity, but I mean some other work have tried to argue in relation to truth that a standard of correctness is normative enough for being an interesting notion of normativity. So logical normativity seems to be the only relevant normativity in suppositional reasoning. And that means that the correctness of suppositional reasoning cannot be explained by appealing to norms of truth or evidence, since suppositional reasoning can be good even if none of the premises or conclusion are true or justified. Now, the usual line of resistance here is to say, well, but nevertheless, we are still interested in sort of understanding what's wrong with a subject not following the logical rules, even in suppositional reasoning, because if we were not in a suppositional context, this person would probably end up with falsity or would not being guaranteed to end up with truths if she started from truth. And so in a sense, I don't want to doubt that, in the sense that I think that truth is still in the picture in terms of normative pressure or normative constraint. My point is that there might be an underlying notion of correctness that is independent of truth that might be operating in the background. And this is a case that we can see also in other situations where we have some sort of normative dilemma. So, we have justification norms and truth norms, and sometimes they are in conflict. And most of the time when we want to criticize someone for like having ended up with a certain belief is because the belief is false. And that kind of explanation trumps the explanation of, because it's unjustified. I mean, actually, the belief could be very well justified, but the fact that it is false trumps any other sort of normative consideration. So it's incorrect because it is false. And in the case at hand here, I think something similar is going on. So we might still make reference to normativity of truth as a sort of trumping explanation in many contexts with respect to what's going on with a subject reasoning illogically, so to speak. But there is, I think, also an underlying notion of correctness that is tied to logic, which is not, so the role of which is more evident when we are trying to sort of focus on context, like the suppositional context, where we are not taking a commitment to truth or falsity or justification. So that's just my sort of understanding of the picture here. So just to conclude, the main thought here is that logic tells us whether a certain pattern of reasoning based on deducing is correct or incorrect, and not when it is correct or incorrect to perform such a reasoning, nor whether we should believe or disbelieve a certain conclusion that has been reached via reasoning. Okay. So logic plays a role in assessing whether a certain combination of attitudes towards a set of proposition is permissible or impermissible, but not when it is permissible or impermissible to have such a combination of attitudes. So the kind of normativity at issue here is not, as I said, a kind of directive. So logic doesn't provide guidance about what to believe. There is no distinctive logical oath. And this allows for instances of reasoning that are correct, not because they are based on logical validity, logically valid rules of inference, but because they are based on other kinds of entitlement and entailment, like, for example, conceptual or analytic entailment. So in a sense, logical validity is a sufficient but not necessary sort of condition for good reasoning, right? So, and whether a certain piece of reasoning is good or bad, in fact, as a sort of overall sort of evaluation, or whether, or even a piece of reasoning that a reasoner ought to perform or not, will depend on other epistemic analytic factors, among other things. So logic is just a sort of part of a more complex picture, of course, of normativity of reasoning. But nevertheless, what I wanted to defend is the idea that there is a minimal core of logical normativity that is independent of other normative factors and could be seen, especially in certain contexts where we might sort of screen off sort of justification worry or alectic worry about that. And if that's the case, that kind of correctness is peculiar to logic. It just comes from logic and not from something else. Okay, so thank you very much. So I took a bit longer, but yeah, thank you so much.